persuade more people that we don't live in a meritocracy, which is slightly separate from the question of whether we should live in a meritocracy. I think the problem at the moment is that there's a belief among many people that we do live in a meritocracy when we clearly don't.
Silver medal in the individual 200 metres freestyle last night. Duncan Scott got fourth, and he was only 15 100ths behind the gold medal position.
So I've been watching the Olympics, which has been on, and I've been thinking about luck, because look, right, all of those people in the Olympics have worked really, really, really hard to get where they've got to. They've got up stupid early, they've devoted their whole lives to it. But ultimately, if I'd have done that, I wouldn't be in the Olympics. I have not got the Olympic physique, or let's face it, the mentality. There is a huge slice of luck in their success, in them being there in the first place. And that's something we kind of take for granted in sports. One of the reasons we love watching sports people. We love seeing these incredible specimens do their thing. But that applies everywhere, doesn't it? It applies to everything in society. So much of how we get on in life, what our life looks like, where we end up, what we do, the story that we tell ourselves, and whether we are, quote, successful, comes down to luck. And for climate change, that's true as well. Whether it affects us, how much it affects us, whether it's going to hit us now, whether we have the ability to do anything about it, whether it's all our fault in the first place, and what we even think it is. So much of this is down to circumstances of our birth or our life, or things we had nothing to do with, just who we are. So in this episode of Your Brain on Climate, we're going to talk all about luck. I'm talking to Snell and Anita Sangha from the Fairness Foundation. They brought out a brilliant report called Rotten Luck, which is all about the extent to which life circumstances are dictated mostly by luck, not by hard work, despite the fact that that's what we tell ourselves. And we do. Our society, the story of success in our society, is overwhelmingly down to hard work. If you put your mind to it, you can accomplish anything. Look at the story that accompanies people like Donald Trump. Even though he was born into wealth, he still tells a story about how brilliant he is because he is successful, because he is brilliant. Well, hang on a minute, Donald. It's all down to luck. And in this episode, we look at luck. We look at the different types of luck. We look at what the implications are for our society of thinking about luck in a different way. And we have a think about what it means for what we think about climate change and how much of a problem it is anyway. As always, if you hear this noise, it denotes wisdom. The wisdom will not be from me, it'll be from Will and Anita. You don't have to pause the podcast, it means something interesting has been said. Check out the show notes when you're done and you can find a reference for more information. And a massive thanks to everyone who sponsors me on Patreon. It keeps this show on the road. It lets me pay my guests, which I've done here. I think that's really important. It rewards their time, but it means I can get to have the chats I want to have with interesting people, not just people who are selling books, which is often how this stuff kind of works. If you want to chuck in a couple of quid, you can go to www.patreon.com/yourbrainonclimate. And if you can't do that, or you won't do that, you know, times are tough and no obligation and all of that, I'd love it if you gave me a review and write something. It gives me a massive leg up, gives this show a massive leg up. And in a world where 4 out of the 5 top podcasts in the UK are all from the same production company, are all called things like The Rest Is, it's really hard for little indie podcasts to get a foothold, to get adverts and all of that. You can really help with by giving me a review. So please do that. Right, that's enough banging on. Oh yeah, on the Twitter @BrainClimate. Email hello@yourbrainonclimate.com. Right, I'm going to get on with it. We're going to talk about luck, and I'm going to start talking about that now.
Your brain on climate.
First thing I want to say about luck is it's a word that starts to look a bit funny when you see it written down a lot, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah. Hi, Dave. Thanks for having us on. It's a funny word, isn't it? And it's a word that I hadn't thought about much until I wrote this report. And I think most people probably haven't thought much about. And yeah, it looks weird on the paper. And it's a very nebulous concept, a bit like fairness, that we work on more generally. And one thing in particular struck me when I was thinking about it, that there are these different types of luck, and you can read different kind of philosophical papers that divide it into 3 or 7 or probably 500 different sub forms of luck. But to my mind, 2 types stuck out in particular, one being the kind of random luck of do you fall under a bus or do you win the lottery, and the other being something which isn't strictly random but just something outside your control. Yeah, whether you're born into a rich or a poor family, for example.
Right, which is like everyone's circumstances are different. If you are born as, for example, Donald Trump, you have had, in some ways, a lucky start in life, depending on whether or not you think who Donald Trump has turned out to be is, a good thing.
Yeah, and what era of history you're born into, and which country or which part of the world you're born in, and then things that sort of straddle those 2 random, non-random areas as well, like the genetic inheritance that you have, which is sort of random and sort of not, and that's something that often doesn't get discussed when we think about these sorts of things.
Yeah. Well, we are going to unpick all of this for sure, and I want to make sure we talk about this is your brain on climate. Talk about climate change and how circumstances of birth, where you're born in the world, indeed when you're born in the world, could have a massive impact on how much what we even think climate is, and how much it affects us and what we think should be done about it. So we will do that, but this is proper interesting. And first of all, I don't know who wants to take this, but let's talk a bit more about those different types of luck. So would you say you are a lucky person, Anita?
Well, that's a really good question. I would say yes. Yeah, 100%. Like, I was born into a relatively stable family. I got to go to university and that kind of thing. I don't live in like a part of the world that's affected, like deeply affected by the climate crisis. I'm like an able-bodied young woman. I would say so. Obviously, there's some dimensions where I would say maybe a little bit less so. Obviously, I'm a woman of color and that kind of thing. But yeah, across the board, I'm pretty optimistic about my chances of being a lucky person, if that makes sense.
But would you have, I guess you've been looking at this work and studied it and stuff. Would you have said sort of instinctively that you're a lucky person? If someone had just said to you in the street, 5 years ago, are you a lucky person? How would you have thought to answer that question?
I'm thinking about me 5 years ago, and me 5 years ago was probably in their end of their undergrad degree during the pandemic, and was quite stressed. I probably would have said, no, I'm not a lucky person because of the circumstances. I'm the most stressed I've ever been at that point in my life. And obviously, nobody was going to uni. We were all doing our dissertations from our bedrooms and whatnot. Yes, I don't think I would have said that then. Yeah, I think I've also just am somebody that's thought a lot about kind of positionality and how I relate to my work and my kind of just own privilege, essentially. So I got to do that a little bit for my master's thesis. Anyway, that's a whole other tangent. But yeah, now I would say I'm definitely a lucky person. And also just because of the type of work that you do, like you have to take the perspective of so many other people that have it way worse than you. So obviously you're going to realize the position of privilege that you're in.
So Will, when you ask people, are you lucky? Where do people tend to go? How do people tend to answer that question?
So we asked this question in some polling that we did at the start of this year, and we asked a sample of the sort of standard representative sample, right, of 2,000 Brits from a range of political views and income levels and ages and balanced by gender and so on. And it was pretty clear that most people think that bad luck has had an impact on their lives, much more so than good luck. So about 60% of people said that they'd been affected by bad luck. And the proportion who were saying that good luck had more of an impact in their life was more like 10%.
So what do people think what are they reaching for? What have they got, like, I broke my leg, I lost my job, right. Something like that. They're thinking about those big momentous events.
So this is one of the limitations of the polling, is that we don't really get into the why, the kind of underlying reasoning, and especially for something as nebulous as luck, it's hard sometimes to get to really understand just through polling what people are thinking about in terms of those kind of narrower or broader conceptions of luck. But we then asked some questions about, what aspects of people's lives are more influenced by factors within or outside their control, for example. And what that showed was that previous findings about how people think about kind of merit and talent and hard work, if you like, as opposed to factors outside people's control, were echoed by these findings, which is that this kind of meritocratic narrative has a really strong hold, and people are much more likely to think about their wealth, their income level, their educational qualifications, even in their physical health, as being primarily driven by their sort of individual choices, their merit, their hard work, maybe their talents, all those sorts of things, than about things that they have less control over. And that they apply that to themselves, but also to society more broadly.
So by applying it to ourselves, we tend to say, I've had some bad luck, but you know what? I work hard and I've got the stuff I've got because I deserve it. That kind of idea.
Broadly speaking, yes. Yeah, and we didn't find that attitudes to whether people have had good or bad luck in their own lives varied much based on their age or even based on their income. So, high earners we found were just as likely as low earners to say that they've been affected by bad luck. And similarly, looking at, generations, people aged 50 to 64 were the most likely to point to bad luck having an impact on their lives, despite, arguably being one of the luckier generations in terms of economic growth, employment, house prices, and what those things were doing over their lifetimes.
But your contention is, I don't know which of you wants to take this, that actually vast amounts of the life that we have and the success, if you want to call it that, or the things that happen to us is down to luck. Not just luck as in like, does a check for £1 million land on your lap, but other sorts of luck, like who you are, what education you've had, what you're born into, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so that's what we think is the case. And there's lots of research showing that if you divide the population into so-called individualists and structuralists, so people who think that kind of individual factors are most important in determining people's life outcomes, and those who think more about the structural or systemic factors, there's a roughly even split between those two groups. And then there's a third group who are sort of in the middle or undecided. And so the thinking behind this piece of work is it's hard to talk about the structural or systemic impacts on people's lives, partly because we've been conditioned to think in very individualistic ways, and because there's a read across to people's political beliefs, but also just because it's harder to visualize those complex systems and to tell stories about individuals. And so is talking about some of those structural drivers in terms of luck an effective way of making that leap and making those stories about structural factors more resonant with people. And the polling suggests it, to the extent that it answers the question, which it doesn't, it helps to us to ask more questions, really, but suggests that it probably isn't a very easy hill to climb, that there are, partly because people think about luck in this quite narrow way often, and partly just because the meritocratic narrative is so embedded.
If you put your mind to it, you can accomplish anything.
And there's a stat in your report, which is something like one estimate is 80% of the income that we earn in our life is in some way down to luck, the luck of, our circumstances. You wrote in a report, you must agree with it, but do you want to say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so there are all sorts of bits of interesting research about how you measure some of this stuff, and there's lots of anecdotal evidence and sort of individual bits of research. But one of the and this is a stat from an economist, Branko Milanovic, which basically says that 40% of people's earnings is determined by their parental income, but that when you add in factors like their citizenship, so where in the world they're born, their gender, and their race, this rises to about 80%. In other words, that merit, whether that's sort of talent or hard work, is therefore responsible for 20% of people's earnings, with earnings being a kind of proxy for your sort of life outcomes, I guess. While the other 80% is effectively down to luck, given all those things are down to luck.
Wow. I mean, that's massive, right? Like, Anita, this is big stuff. This is basically saying or everyone out there, like Donald Trump, sorry, I'm a bit preoccupied with him at the minute, but like Donald Trump, this I'm a self-made man, I did it all myself. This idea of someone who's like done it all themselves, it's just basically bollocks. Yes?
I want to say yes, but kind of. But I think it is kind of bollocks, let's be honest about it. Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm not going to argue with Branko Milanovic at all, but yeah, I think it's quite a harmful narrative when you realize the implications of that train of thought, right? Like, if you hold these people up as role models and kind of we aspire to be like them and see them as possessing these traits and abilities that we should aspire to have, and that will also lead us to the same outcome. So like that causal link is like, it's just not true. And obviously there's some limited benefit of trying to mimic or copy these types of people, because you might pick up some kind of skill or improve your ability to succeed in a given field, and it could be to some extent kind of advantageous. But at the end of the day, there's really it's not going to do anything if the structural problem is so great and you just can't get past that. Yeah, essentially, yeah. To answer your question, it's kind of bollocks.
Hooray. Very good. Now, it makes me think of something I read. Will, you might know more about this. I got a feeling I got this from you somewhere, but like, people who've made a lot of money on the stock market are often hailed as being like successful on the stock market. It's a thing you can do. But the odds on being successful on the stock market are kind of something like 50-50, i.e. some people are by definition going to be successful because they win, but they haven't necessarily done anything right. They've just gambled correctly. Am I talking rubbish, or does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm struggling to remember the specific argument that you make there, but I've certainly seen things along those lines. And there's plenty of stats to show that, for example, people born in the winter are more likely to become a chief exec than people born in the summer.
Why?
Well, I assume this is to do with the fact that people born in the summer are younger in their years at school, and that there's a sort of accumulated disadvantage that you get as a result of that in many cases. And with a child born right at the end of August, I've seen that play out to some extent.
So this, and that's, it just seems so important. Before we sort of get into kind of, the way this all distorts society, it feels like quite a psychologically big thing to carry, right? This idea, I mean, Anita, I was giving you the Trump example, and yeah, all right, there are particularly egregious examples of people who go, I am self-made, but I think we all kind of do it. Like, I quite like telling myself that most of the things that I've got that I value, I have in some sense deserved, right? And it feels like what you're doing is naming something that might be a bit hard to get your head around, that you don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very fair and important point to make. Like, you do this to some extent. There's the correspondence bias where you will tend to attribute, outcomes to dispositional factors or things that are kind of internal to you as an individual versus the situation or the external factors like luck or kind of environmental context or social context or whatever it is. And then also related to your point about kind of deluding ourselves a little bit, we do kind of have a core social motive to, have positive self-esteem and to like ourselves, and other people like us as well because of the way that we are, and to get on with other people and that kind of thing, and like belong to a group, and believing this idea that we are kind of, the masters of our universe or whatever, like facilitates that to some extent. And obviously if you live in a very individualistic culture, which places more emphasis on ability and effort rather than luck, obviously, like those two things are going to compound pretty aggressively to some level of narcissism.
And I guess like, I want to do an episode all about optimism, but one of the things that I find interesting about optimism is like, we have to kind of fundamentally be bothered to get off our arse and do stuff every day. Otherwise we individually and as a species would die, right? So we had to, from an optimism point of view, we have to kind of be optimistic it'll work out all right. But then maybe there's something here as well, which is we have to kind of believe that we can affect our outcomes in some way, i.e. that hard work achieves something. Or am I reaching too much with that?
I think there's something around, and Anita knows, I think, a bit more about this than I do, but this idea of just world theory, or these sort of system justifying beliefs, right? That we want to believe that we live in a basically fair society. We want to believe that, when we work hard, we'll be rewarded and all this kind of stuff. And so that, the popularity of the rags to riches stories is not some kind of conspiracy by elites to keep everyone in check. It's to do with a deep held desire in all of us to believe in those sorts of stories. And what's interesting about that is that there are obviously all sorts of ways in which people who've made it in life, however you measure that, are particularly motivated to believe that it's as a result of their own hard work and everything else. But it's that these ways of thinking about the world also apply to people who haven't done as well. And while there are some studies that people, on lower incomes, for example, are often more aware of the sort of structural drivers or barriers, there's also plenty of evidence that those people have equally internalized this kind of idea that it's a fair society, we live in a meritocracy, and therefore that, I bear some responsibility for where I've ended up.
What do you think the big implications are for how we should run our societies if we accept that the majority of anything that anyone has got is down to some sort of luck? Should we therefore do things like tax really differently? What else should we do differently, do you think?
So I think, part of the problem with the way that most people, lots of people, at least in the UK, think about luck and think about merit, if you like, sort of individual versus structural factors, is that if you believe that where people end up in life is primarily governed by their individual effort and talent or lack of, then that is an argument against an active state. It's an argument against redistribution through the tax system. It's an argument against a sort of generous social security system. So, in order to persuade people of the need for ensuring that everyone has, the basic needs, regardless of the sort of talent or hard work, but also that work is fairly rewarded, that everyone has genuinely equal opportunities to maximize their potential and so on, which was what we call the kind of fair necessities, these kind of core principles of fairness. We need to persuade more people that we don't live in a meritocracy, which is slightly separate from the question of whether we should live in a meritocracy. I think the problem at the moment is that there's a belief among many people that we do live in a meritocracy when we clearly don't. Having said that, there is this increasing level of awareness, not just among people who are living at the sharp edge of lots of these problems, but among those with more resources as well, that we don't live in a fair society. So you've got this kind of odd kind of interplay at the moment between the empirical facts that have become more apparent over the last decade or two with austerity and with cost of living crisis and COVID and so on, where people's attitudes to things like public services, tax, social security are evolving based on what people are seeing and hearing about. But at the same time, the sort of mindsets that underlie those attitudes, such as the meritocratic and individualistic mindsets, are more like the kind of oil tanker or are taking much more time to catch up.
I guess it underpins so much of the kind of neoliberal economic idea, right? The idea that all you need to do is kind of unleash people's hard work and society will take care of itself. But, more positively, in the UK, we've got an NHS, which pretty much seems to be founded on the idea that it don't matter who you are or what your circumstances are, we're kind of here for you. And despite, attempts to hack it down, it still lives. So I suppose it's, to an extent we do get that argument, right?
We do. And I think a lot of this is about taking those founding principles of the NHS and applying them to other parts of society, because the NHS really is about, designing out bad luck in terms of health. When it works well, that it doesn't matter if you can afford to pay for private healthcare or not, because you've got the NHS and it will come in regardless. And so, there you can make similar arguments about, for example, unemployment. benefits that the UK pays a much lower percentage of income to people who lose their jobs than many countries in Europe, where you get sort of 80%, and it supports you back into work. So it's a sort of social insurance scheme that helps to compensate for bad luck, but also produces economic benefits because it gets people back into work more quickly.
Your brain on climate.
It seems to me that whether or not you're on the sharp end of climate change, to an extent we all are, but right now, right here and now, how existential it is for you and the extent to which you caused it is overwhelmingly down to luck. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, where in the world you live and the position of power that you're in terms of your ability to either sit and be like us and get to talk about it all day, or are on the front lines of the climate crisis.
So say a bit more maybe then about the different factors that are basically either about the privilege or otherwise you're born into, or the circumstances you're born into that might affect how you even think about climate change.
I mean, okay, so if we're thinking about how you think about climate change, I guess there's a few different things to think about. If you're thinking about where in the world you are and your level of exposure to the climate crisis is obviously one thing, and I think there's a decent amount of evidence to show that your exposure to a given hazard obviously has a substantial effect on your kind of perceived severity of it and how seriously you might take it. That's one thing. There's also, I mean, I guess, again, thinking about where you are in relation to decision-making processes and ability to engage with this issue is another thing to think about. Are you somebody that is kind of excluded from political decision-making, or you're more able to exert some influence? That's another thing. I guess in terms of socioeconomic inequalities, and I guess coming back to some of the terms in the report, like constitutional luck, I think thinking about where in society you are and exposure, again, I mean, maybe this is coming back to the first point, but a level of protection that you can kind of afford to have from some of those impacts.
Well, I guess also these things compound as well. Like, presumably, being in a place that is being ravaged by climate change might affect other things like your ability to earn a living, which might affect your ability to take part in wider democracy and things like that, right?
Absolutely. And I guess one other thing that I was thinking about when we were talking is kind of luck in terms of information that you kind of either have access to or receive. Obviously, if you just, I'm thinking about in terms of like social media coverage of climate change or something like that, or like kind of what you might see on the news or anything like that. And that's not necessarily always within your control. Obviously, there is some extent. I mean, it could be within some extent because obviously you can kind of curate your own kind of media intake. But in terms of the predominant messages that you're surrounded by with regard to climate change, like it's not always in your hands, but it has an effect on you. And that obviously then shapes how you think about these issues.
Well, I think there's definitely something that is really, really interesting about why we think, what we even think climate change is and where we get those ideas from. And one of the things I love about your work is it's looking into these kind of deeper stories that are underneath the big stories that we tell ourselves as society, but these ideas that have been there for a very long time about, the rags to riches story, or if you work hard, you get what you deserve, and these things. And actually, we all like what we think about something like climate change, which is kind of a big, fluffy, abstract thing, really. Like it could be whatever you want it to mean as a concept, but the extent to which we feel it and what we feel about it is determined by a load of stuff we don't even understand, like these things like who we trust and the stories that work for us. And, and I suppose there's a bit of a potential obstacle or a challenge, or I'm interested in what you think on this, about like one of the stories about climate change that we hear is if we put our minds to it as a society, if we work jolly hard, then we can fix it. And there's probably an element of luck about climate itself. Like, as I understand it, we don't know if we can fix it. Like there's elements in the models. There are some scenarios in which the whole thing spirals out of control. So, yeah.
Well, I think the climate crisis is an interesting example of, as you say, some of these deep underlying ways of thinking and talking about the world where, you've got, at one level, you've got the very kind of individualistic way of thinking about, the climate crisis is all about recycling or cutting down my individual carbon footprint, and that whole critique of underplaying the broader systemic issues, and at the same time you've got the risk of fatalism, haven't you? You've got the risk of losing the optimism that you were talking about earlier, and that feels like one of the other kind of meta mindsets, is this kind of idea that if you believe that, in the case of the economy or society, that the system is rigged, or in the case of the climate that, the tipping points are baked in or whatever else, then that fatalism can be very disempowering. So I think one of the challenges is, how do you take from a sort of starting point of what in many cases a fairly individualistic way of thinking about things, how do you sort of take the positive aspects of that way of thinking in terms of sort of individual agency and all those sorts of things, but then kind of layer it onto a more sophisticated understanding of systems and structures that doesn't take you down a kind of fatalism, we're all screwed, there's nothing we can do about it routes. It reminds me a bit of the this book, The Ministry for the Future.
Kim Stanley Robinson.
Yeah. That feels to me like it treads quite an interesting path, not so much on the kind of individual or systemic side of things, but in terms of the kind of pessimism, optimism, in particular, bridging the divide in terms of the debate between, either arguing that technocratic solutions by themselves will sort it all out and technology will come to our rescue at some point fairly soon, or that the counter argument that the whole system, is just fundamentally inimical to resolving the climate crisis and needs to be rebuilt from the ground up, by arguing that we have to start where we start from, but that there is scope to quite radically redesign the institutions we have at the moment. And that feels like it sort of plays into that, or is a parallel to that broader argument about how you weave together the kind of best bits of the individualistic thinking that is so much part of our societies with that more sophisticated kind of understanding of how systems and structures work.
The hardest worker in the room is always going to be the talented guy who doesn't work hard. In the end, maybe not every time, but in the end, hard work always wins. Talent doesn't guarantee you anything.
Because you're not saying anywhere in your work, firstly, the hard work isn't a factor, right?
No.
People, all things being equal, people who work harder will, do better. But all things are not equal, and so So there's an element to which what we do about climate change is going to be hard work, and and it requires everyone to kind of do their bit. But also, more importantly, the systems that are unfair in general are also unfair on climate change, and only a systemic thing can really get sort of the speed and scale of what we need, right?
Yeah, and I think going back to your early point about compounding, again, you can look at that in terms of climate, you can look at it in terms of our society and economies more generally, that, disadvantage or bad luck or whatever you want to call it, compounds both, if you like, kind of horizontally and vertically. In other words, there are sort of intersectional aspects of disadvantage to do with, where in the world you're born, your race, your gender, what level of wealth you're born into, and so on. But that also, that, as you say, that in systems that aren't actively correcting for those disadvantages, they compound very rapidly over time, and that can be over someone's individual life course, or also if you look at generations. And so, the absence of a proactive attempts to correct for that will just allow those compound effects to gain in strength.
So, right, Will, okay, we've just got a new Prime Minister, but let's imagine for a minute that we didn't. If you were in charge and you wanted to change the way some important systemic stuff works in the country, to recognise and correct for the fact that so much of our life is governed by luck, what would you do?
So I think that one of the core issues that is not being thought about or talked about, far less acted on, enough at the moment is around wealth inequality. And you can think about that in a domestic UK context, but obviously equally in a global context. And a lot of what we do at the Fairness Foundation is to marshal and communicate the evidence that wealth inequality is not only fundamentally unfair, in large part because a lot of it is down to luck, but also that it's actively damaging our economy, it's holding back opportunity, it's bad for our society, it threatens our democracy, and also undermines action on net zero. So action to reduce the level of wealth inequality, but also to reduce the extent to which wealth inequality bleeds into those other areas of society and the economy would be a priority for me. And part of that has to have a tax component, so reforming aspects of our tax system, and that could include a wealth tax, so an annual tax on wealth above a certain limit, but there are all sorts of other ways in which we can tax wealth that don't involve that. Other systemic drivers, it feels to me that, and this again, particularly relevant for climate, but has a broader resonance as well, is that we don't think and act in a long-term ways nearly enough in politics. That short-termism is baked into our politics as well as into, our economy more broadly. And I think there are some interesting early stage fixes to that. So obviously in Wales, you've got the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act that was brought in a few years ago, and it's too early to say how that's working in terms of the practical implications. The only real policy change that can be pointed to on that one, as I understand it, is that the M4 motorway wasn't extended, which is a big decision with some far-reaching implications. But other than that, it's really an early stage in quite a long process of culture change, but a really interesting model. And you've got the UN Summit for the Future, I think it's called, happening in September this year, which will be really interesting in terms of that broader global conversation about long-term decision-making and future generations. So I think those are the two of the things that I would point to. I mean, many people would argue that we need a reform of the democratic system, the electoral system, particularly in the UK, in order to bring in some of these policies that would deal with, the huge outsized impact of luck on our lives, arguably in the form of these different forms of inequality. The recent election results in the UK put an interesting spin on the pros and cons of different options for electoral reform, but certainly it's an issue that could be looked at.
Anita, do you think there's anything about if you were in charge of telling the story of the country, was there would you change the story to reflect the fact that maybe hard work isn't everything?
Absolutely. I guess actually while you were both talking, I was thinking about what would I do, and kind of related to this point, I think trying to reform public, legal, or kind of political education or citizenship more generally. I'm thinking about younger people or just personal experience. If you are somebody that doesn't have a sound, strong concept of how, politics works, let's say, or, the democratic process, and you're a child and you grow up in a society and you just don't engage with it and you don't understand how it's broken and failing you, then what are you supposed to do about it? How are you supposed to develop any kind of expectation that you can fix it? So I think that's probably where I would start. And then I guess within that, you would then have to start talking about, well, this is how the system has failed you, and this is how this is why we are where we are. And that would obviously involve some maybe shaping the history curriculum a little bit in a different direction than it is currently.
And I wonder if there's anything a story we can tell ourselves as a result of all of this. So here's an example. I think this is in your report, or if not, it's certainly alluded to in there, which is seeing people suffering homelessness on the street. And there's a debate that sometimes you will hear about, should you give them money or not? Is it, and it feels like one of the implications of your report is, however it's ended up, the person who's on the street is there because of bad luck. It might be very specific bits of bad luck. They lost their job. They had nothing else to turn to. Or it might be deeper, longer running circumstantial luck that has compounded to leave them where they are. Whatever, the point is, they almost certainly haven't gone there through choice, and it's bad luck. And we should teach ourselves to be a bit more kind of compassionate at the fact that these sort of things can just happen and do happen all the time due to luck? Is that a story that we should start, maybe that example, but more broadly, start telling ourselves a bit more?
Yeah, I was just going to say briefly that I pretty much agree with that. I think the thing that sticks out to me with that example is you're essentially taking someone else's perspective, right, and trying to think backwards from this person's homeless. How did they get there? Okay, well, it could have been this, that, and the other, and you're trying to think about the causal chain of events that would have led to that from their perspective. And obviously, in taking someone else's perspective, you are more like to empathize with them, and I think that can try and foster, again, like to your point, some of that compassion and understanding of this isn't entirely someone's fault. You're not holding them morally or causally responsible for this, and maybe we should try to think about, okay, or if that was me in that position, what would I want? And maybe we just be a bit nicer to each other. But yeah, well, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to talk about there's a subsector of philosophical thought called luck egalitarianism, which I briefly dove down the rabbit hole of a couple of years ago.
Now he's talking. Now he's going.
But not very far, because page 3 of the first book I read was full of equations I didn't understand, so I stopped. But that's quite interesting because it basically argues that inequalities that reflect what they call brute luck, or kind of, if you like, passive luck, so things over which people have no control, are unjust and should be corrected for by society, whereas inequalities that arise from people's choices, which could be how hard they work, but also could be kind of active luck, or what they call option luck, so, gambling, for example, or smoking, maybe, are okay and shouldn't be corrected for or prevented by society. What's interesting about that, in my view, false division between those two things, is it leads you to some quite radical conclusions in both directions. So, for example, because they see the talent that you're born with as outside your control, they argue that we should take radical measures as a society to even out inequalities that are a result of differences in talent. Which that would make a big difference to how footballers are paid, for example. So that's quite radical. I'm not suggesting I agree with it, but it's in one direction. And in the other direction, they'd argue that someone who has developed lung cancer because of smoking, assuming that you can make that causal link safely, or has ended up on the streets for reasons of their own making, at least to some extent, should be effectively left to fend for themselves. And as you were both saying, that's where, how on earth do you make those distinctions at an individual level? And then, even if you can do that, how as a society would you be able to, make that work in a sort of logical, feasible way in terms of policies? It doesn't really work.
Listen, both, thank you so much for coming on. The last question I wanted to ask, I forgot to do this earlier. Do men or women feel differently about this? Is this anything where views are particularly differ between either genders or between how people vote? Is there any sort of obvious people in society who have particularly strong views about luck one way or the other?
Not really, no. So we didn't see in our polling, which is it's very provisional. We didn't see particularly strong splits based on people's gender. There were some differences based on people's voting history. We broke people down by whether they voted for Conservatives, Labour, Lib Dems, or other in 2019, which was the most recent election at that point. So, for example, Lib Dems are the most likely to think that they've had good luck of those three groups, and Conservative voters the least. Yeah. But the differences are relatively minor, because I think these sorts of general views about luck are so widespread.
So again, this matters, doesn't it, in a case of it's not, if you are someone on the left and you are inclined to think that it's only Tories think like this, no, it ain't, it's you too, mate. It's like pretty much everyone thinks that luck has had a relatively minor part in their success, and that they, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think what's interesting about luck is it doesn't neatly map across to this kind of 1 in 3 people who think about systems and structures. So they are perhaps people who are more likely than others to think that luck has a bigger part to play in our lives, but there is still a bit of a sort of discontinuity in that relationship. So yeah, something to explore in more detail at some point.
Thank you both so much for coming on Your Brain on Climate. How can people find out more about your work and follow you both and read anything else that you think they should read?
So we publish regular reports on our website at fairnessfoundation.com, and we also publish a weekly Substack called Fair Comment, which is at faircomments.co.uk.
So do you feel lucky? That's the question. Having listened to all of that, have you recalibrated your impression of how much of your lot, whatever your lot is, whether it's a good lot or a bad lot, is down to luck versus hard work? It is, I meant what I said quite early on, it is a bit of a thing to carry, a bit of a thing to reflect on. And I think if you sit and think about it for a bit, you can't help but feel more compassionate to people and to feel a bit more humble about all of your stuff, and also to question some of the stories that you tell yourself about how you deserve things and how brilliant you are, and how, you know, it's all right for you to have a nice lie down and a cup of tea because you deserve it, didn't you? Another shout out, please give me a review on your podcast medium of choice, and do consider chucking in on the Patreon if you like the show. I will be back very soon with another episode of this waffle. So until then, please look after yourself, enjoy what is left of the Olympics, try not to get too hot in the UK increasingly warm summer, and I will see you very soon. Okay, bye.